Another thing to consider, going back to what we were talking about earlier with cell size or pot size, you put a big pot like this on a heat mat. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having an awesome day. It is Monday, February 24th here in South Georgia, and on today's video we're going to check on some of our spring seed starting going on in this little greenhouse behind me, and I'm going to tell you about 7 common mistakes that you don't want to make when growing out your own transplants for the spring garden. So first, let's see what we've got going on in here. There's nothing in those 3 trays there yet. That's where I'm going to be planting my watermelons later today. Moving along, we've got our tomato and pepper tray here. Our tomato seedlings are looking great. We've started fertilizing them already. We'll talk more about that in a minute. I do have the edge of this tray still on the heat mat, trying to get some of these hotter peppers to germinate. Those last 2 columns there are seeds from a variety called Armageddon that a viewer sent me several years ago. I grew some one year and was kind of cleaning out my seed stash, so I figured I'd plant them. They may not ever come up. I'm going to give them probably another week or so though. And then in this tray with the smaller 1/2-inch cells, we've got a lot of basil planted. I like to grow a lot of basil because the bees love it and we like to use it a lot in the kitchen. This was another part of my seed stash clean out. Found several packs of basil seeds, had a lot of seeds in them, so I figured we'd throw them in here. They've only been in there a few days, so hopefully we'll get somewhat decent germination rate out of those old basil seeds. And then in this little tray here, I've got some newer varieties that we just added to the website a week or 2 ago that didn't get put in that tray right there. Variety of tomatoes called Garden Peach. Grew that one a few years ago. Really, really good. And then we've got some more peppers here. We've got the Pathfinder Serrano, the Soundwave Jalapeno, and this red habanero called Velociraptor. And then lastly, I've got a tray of flower seeds, more seed clean out stuff here. So not the greatest germination, but some of it has come up. My zinnias came up okay, considering the fact that I did put 2 seeds per cell. Not close to 100% germination, but I think we'll have enough flowers there to work with. These giant marigold seeds, those older seeds, didn't germinate well at all. Might have to buy some more of those because it looks like we're only going to have maybe 4 or 5 viable transplants there. So we've got a decent amount of stuff started, but we're not finished by any means. Got to get my watermelon seeds planted today. Then in the next week or 2, got to get my Seminole pumpkin seeds started, my dwarf cowhorn ochre seeds started, and then I'm going to have to replant some of this stuff, some of those old seeds that didn't germinate. So now let's jump into this list of 7 common seed starting mistakes. And number 1 on our list would be starting too early, and it happens to a lot of us. We get really excited, especially when seed catalogs start arriving. When we get that first little glimpse of warm weather, you know, in those late winter months, we get really excited and we start our seeds too early. And the consequence of doing that is that you end up with some root-bound transplants that are going to have a lot more transplant shock when you put them in the ground. They're going to take a little longer to kind of get going and start growing well. Now obviously, if your transplants do start to get really root bound in their cells, you can always step them up to a larger pot, but that's using more soil than we have to use. So we'd like to avoid doing that if possible. We don't want to use more soil or seed starting mix than necessary. And while we're on the topic of cell size or container size, one common misconception I think a lot of gardeners have is that they have to use a larger pot like that to start, for example, their tomato seeds. And that's simply not true. If you time it right, you can grow out a beautiful, ready to go in the ground tomato transplant in a cell like that, or a cell like that that's about 1 inch square. You don't need a ton of soil or a big pot to grow out a nice plant. Now obviously you want to be resourceful and use what you have. You don't want to go out and buy a bunch of nice seed starting trays just for the sake of not using as much seed starting mix. But I wanted to make that point there that you don't need a huge container. A lot of people will use old red Dixie cups because that's what they have around, and that's perfectly fine. But understand that you don't need to use that much soil to grow out a really nice tomato transplant. And speaking of soil, mistake number 2 is using the wrong type of soil. You don't want to use something that's really chunky, because that seedling is going to have a hard time forming a nice root ball with a chunky media there. You want to use something that's nice and fine. You want to use a seed starting mix, not a chunkier potting mix. Now this is what I use because I can get it locally in these big bales, usually 30 or 40 bucks a bale. There are quite a few different types of Pro Mix out there. I use this one because this is what my supplier carries. I haven't really tried any of the other versions, but this one works well for me. So you can see there, that stuff is nice and fine, has a decent amount of perlite in it. It drains well, which is a nice quality you want to have in your seed starting mix. And moving along to mistake number 3, which is planting too deep. You don't want those seedlings to have to really struggle to emerge from the soil. When you're planting in these cell trays like I have behind me, you don't need to plant things very deep at all. So regardless of whether I'm planting a pumpkin seed, a tomato seed, a pepper seed, or maybe even a tiny flower seed, I only plant mine about that deep right there. Just make a nice little shallow depression in that cell, put my seed right in the center of it. And then we always cover with the perlite like you see on this tray, but with that shallow depression and the little bit of perlite covering, it's not planted very deep at all. And then mistake number 4 would be not having the ideal temperature for the seeds you're trying to germinate. If you mess around, you might get that tray too hot, or maybe you haven't got it warm enough to get some really consistent germination. Now this time of year we germinate everything in here on these large heat mats. Sometimes we take the tray off the heat mat as soon as the seeds germinate. Sometimes we may leave it on there for another week or two. Just depends on whether or not we need this heat mat space for something else. And I do have thermostats for these heat mats, but I am not using them this year. I was having some issues with them tripping my outlets bad. Don't really know why that was happening. So I just have mine plugged in and running wide open. Now it's important to note here that a heat mat, even the really good commercial ones, are only going to boost that soil temperature about 10 degrees when you're running them wide open. Now a thermostat can help you from getting that tray too hot and really scorching those seeds or seedlings. So keep that 10 degrees number in mind, because if where you're starting your seeds at, be it your seed starting room, your garage, or maybe even you have a little greenhouse like we do, if it's 60 degrees in there and you're needing to get it up to 80 degrees for some really good germination, that heat mat is only going to get you to 70 degrees. So it can only help you so much. Another thing to consider, going back to what we were talking about earlier with cell size or pot size, you put a big pot like this on a heat mat, it's going to be a lot harder for that heat mat to consistently warm all the soil in here. But if you're using those more shallow trays like we have back here, it's a lot easier to consistently warm that soil in those cells. And one more tip on temperature, don't do what I did here. If you're trying to grow some really hot peppers, put those in a separate tray, because they're always going to need more heat and they're always going to take a lot longer. Best to put them in a separate tray so you're not doing what we're doing here, just hanging half the tray on the seed mat trying to get some of this really hot stuff to sprout. And now to mistake number 5, which is overwatering or underwatering, and I see this one all the time. Now as you can see behind me there, I'm not a fan of bottom watering. I water all my trays from the top, just let that water drip down onto this dirt floor in the greenhouse. And I'm not sure who it was, probably another YouTuber, but at some point somebody told a lot of people that watering trays, watering seedlings from the top was a terrible idea, because we hear from people all the time that say, I thought top watering was bad, you're not supposed to be doing it, you're supposed to be watering everything from the bottom. Completely ignoring the fact that every tomato, pepper, squash, cucumber that you've ever bought in a grocery store was grown from a transplant that was top watered in a big greenhouse. But anyways, I digress. I'm not personally a big fan of bottom watering because I don't like having to deal with the excess water in the bottom of that tray. And like I said, I have a dirt floor in here, so just letting it run through is perfectly fine. I understand if you're growing indoors, you have to have some kind of catchment there. You just can't let the water run everywhere. I also really like top watering because it helps me ensure that I'm not under watering. So when we water these trays every afternoon, I'll water them to the point where I can see that water dripping out the bottom of your tray. So many times I see people just spraying water on their seed starting trays, and they're not spraying nearly enough water. What happens is the top half is moist, but the bottom of it is just as powder dry as it can be, which ends up not growing a very good transplant. So however you decide to water, make sure you water enough so that seed starting mix in that cell or cup or pot, whatever you're using, stays consistently moist from top to bottom. Now, mistake number 6 would be light issues. Now, we've never had to use any grow lights around here because we're growing in this little greenhouse here. We don't need grow lights. But if you're growing indoors, you're going to need grow lights. Otherwise, those plants are going to get really leggy really fast. So make sure you have a system in place where you can raise and lower those grow lights. You can keep them right above those plants so they're not reaching for light and getting leggy and getting kind of weak on you. And lastly, mistake number 7 would be improper fertilization or just not fertilizing at all. So I can still grow out a viable tomato transplant in those trays with the Pro Mix without ever fertilizing them. But I can grow out a much better tomato transplant, and I can do it much faster if I feed them. Now, I use AgriThrive exclusively on my seedlings in here. That's just my personal preference, but you can use synthetic fertilizers as well. Just be very, very careful early on. You can start fertilizing as soon as those transplants or those seedlings have their second set of leaves, what we call true leaves. You can start then, but start with a very, very low dosage. Way easier to start with a low concentration and kind of amp it up as they grow than making it too hot and burning them and possibly killing them. Now, I do have an injection system for this little greenhouse, but right now, since the only thing I'm really fertilizing is these tomato seedlings, because we're still waiting on everything else to come up or get a little bit bigger, right now I'm just doing it with this spray bottle. So I put an ounce or 2 of AgriThrive in this spray bottle, fill it up with water, and just spray these tomato leaves every afternoon. Now, even though we're using an organic fertilizer, it can still burn those leaves if we leave that fertilizer residue on the leaves. So what I always do is come in here, I spray down the leaves with this first, and then I take my watering wand and rinse any of that residue off the leaves, because we're really trying to get it down there to the roots anyways. And that's another reason why I really don't like bottom watering, because you let this stuff sit down in a bottom tray, it's going to get pretty stinky pretty fast. I'd much rather just spray it on top of the plants, rinse it off, and let any excess water drip out the bottom onto the dirt here. So those are not all the possible mistakes you could make when growing out your own transplants for the spring garden, but I think that's a pretty good exhaustive list, and if you can avoid doing those 7 things, I think you'll be all right. Now, before we go, since I am going to be getting some watermelon seeds started today, I figured I'd share with you which seedless and seeded varieties we're going to be growing this year. We get a lot of people asking which ones we're growing, because we always grow some different ones every year. So we always grow a red seedless and then either a yellow or orange seedless, and the boys always kind of help me decide which ones we're going to grow. This year the theme is red and yellow. So the red seedless we're growing is a new variety called Starship. It's supposed to be really, really sweet, and the outside looks really cool. It's got that dark green exterior, kind of like a sugar baby watermelon, but also has some of those little yellow dots, kind of like a moon and stars watermelon. And the yellow seedless we're growing is one called Golden Crisp, and it supposedly makes a nice, big, just beautiful yellow seedless watermelon. And then for my pollinator variety, the seeded variety that we have to grow in the presence of those seedless varieties, I'm going with a variety called Yellow Doll. Supposedly a great eating watermelon, but also a great pollinator if you're growing some seedless ones. So we'll not only benefit from all the flowers it makes pollinating our seedless watermelon plants, but we'll also enjoy some more delicious yellow watermelons. Now, I got to mention this because I know it will happen if and when some of y'all go online to buy seeds because you want to grow some of these same watermelon varieties we're growing. You're going to immediately discover that we spend a ton of money on watermelon seeds. And a lot of people are not going to want to grow these varieties just because they're so expensive. But you have to remember here, with all this gardening we do, some of it, yes, we're saving money at the grocery store, but some of it is just for fun. So when I grow an entire 30 by 35 plot of watermelons, I'm not figuring up how many watermelons I harvested, the average cost of a watermelon at the store, and trying to get some kind of profit and loss analysis going there. That's not what it's about when it comes to watermelons. Because of all the things we grow around here, the boys and I have the most fun growing watermelons, picking watermelons, eating, tasting these watermelons, seeing which ones we like the best. We have an absolute blast doing it. And so in my opinion, it doesn't really matter the cost of it all. We're not trying to save money by growing these watermelons. This is just something fun we like to do. And there are far worse things that you could blow money on than growing watermelons with your kids. And maybe you have some stuff like that you like to grow just for fun. You're not really worried about whether you're saving money at the grocery store or not. Or maybe you're only growing food to save money at the grocery store. Nothing wrong with either way. And if you want to learn how to germinate your own seedless watermelon seeds, watch this video right here, because it is tricky. It's not like any other seed out there. There are specific things you got to do, but watch this video. You'll learn how to do it. Check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.